What's the scariest real-life story you have? Story 1. When I was in college during finals week, my two best friends and I would meet up after a long night in the library to smoke pot and go our separate ways for the night, since they lived on campus while I lived off campus. I would pick them up in my car when I was done studying, and we would park down in a large commuter parking lot overlooking a wide river and dense woods. It was about midnight, and we were doing our usual routine, smoking and listening to music, when we noticed a local police officer driving around with a spotlight in the nearly empty parking lot. Paranoia set in, so we put out the bowl and waited in silence for him to leave. Eventually he left, and we continued on. All of a sudden, this woman came out of nowhere looking completely ragged and stopped in front of my car, staring straight into the windshield at us. Shivers went down my spine as I could not understand why she would be doing that. She eventually walked away into the woods. At that point, I was ready to leave, but the one of the three of us who did not see her directly was convinced that we were just high and paranoid. So we stayed. I was shaking and felt entirely uneasy and unsafe, so I kept looking over my left shoulder behind my car. My friends were joking about how weird it was, but I was just stuck in my paranoia, feeling like we were not safe. A few minutes later, I had begun to look over my shoulder less and less, but when I happened to look behind my car again, I saw that same woman sprinting toward the driver's door with a knife in her hand. My body reacted instantly, and I started the car without saying a word and sped out of the parking lot, not stopping until I was completely off campus. She had crept around all the cars in the parking lot, circling the entire perimeter to attack my car from the back. Later, we found out the police were looking for her. She had previously killed her husband and the woman he was cheating with. The police were sure she was planning to steal my car with violent force. It was hands down the scariest thing that has ever happened to me, and my friends would agree. Story 2. I was 17, at home watching my baby sister, who was 11. She was downstairs watching television, and I was upstairs playing video games, getting ready for bed. My sister was pretty awesome, and I could always trust her to go to bed at a decent time. To my surprise, my mom peeked her head into my darkened room, and I cheerfully waved goodnight. I could not see her face, just a head poking into my room, looking at me before backing away. About half an hour later, I went downstairs for some water and was surprised again, this time by my sister, who was still watching the end of her show. I did not care that she was still up, but my mother would have promptly sent her to bed since she was much stricter. She asked me if I knew when Mom and Dad would be home, and I immediately took her hand and led her out to my car, where we sat while I called my parents. They came home immediately. No doors or windows were unlocked. Besides the side door I opened to bring my sister outside. I still wonder who or what the hell poked its head into my room that night. Story 3. When I was about 10 or 11, my brother, my friend, and I were playing outside in the backyard. We ended up going over by a big pine tree, and my friend found a butcher knife on the ground underneath it, along with a bottle of ketchup and a dead gopher lying next to it. We told my mom, who called the police, and they suspected it was a local criminal whose father lived in our neighborhood and who had been seen hanging around the area. A couple of nights later, I was fast asleep in my bed when around 2 a.m, my mom came flying into my room and started yelling out the window, "Get out of here!" It turned out the criminal was hiding in the tree, and my mom saw him walking around our yard. He fled after she yelled, and a police officer drove around our road with a spotlight, searching for him. They never found out what happened after that, but even 12 years later, I still remember how scared I was. Story 4. My sister and I were very young, and our great-uncle, who was a priest, loved to tell us ghost stories before bedtime. These were not your average campfire tales. They were the kind that were read from a book and took quite a while. Every Thanksgiving, my family stayed with my great-uncle, and my sister and I shared a room with 2 twin beds. We moved to the same bed, and my great-uncle sat on the other, reading us a new ghost story. That particular night, he told a tale about a man who lost his hand and was given the amputated hand of a murderer to replace it. My great-uncle was a natural storyteller, probably the best I have ever known, and throughout the story he used voices and mimicked gestures with his hands to frighten us even more. When he finished, he closed the book and told us it was time to pray before bed. As my sister and I knelt beside the bed to pray, my mother suddenly reached out from under the bed and grabbed both of us. I had no idea she had been hiding there the entire time. To this day, it remains one of the most terrifying moments of my life. And every Thanksgiving, they both love to retell that story and laugh about it. Story 5. This happened to a friend of mine, and she was surprisingly calm about it afterward. It was a summer evening, around 8 or 9 at night, not too late, with the sun still setting. She was driving home and stopped at a traffic light that intersected with the highway. We live in a fairly small town, so there were hardly any other cars out, and she was the only one at the light. Her car was stopped in the lane closest to the left turn lane on one of those 5-lane streets. She was minding her own business, zoning out a little, when suddenly she heard someone trying to open the passenger door. She looked over and saw a disheveled man, clearly high on substances, who had actually managed to open the door. She grabbed a drink from her cup holder and threw it at him. It startled him enough for her to quickly slam the door shut and lock it. He stumbled and reached for the handle again, and when she saw his face, she could tell he was completely out of his mind. By that time, the light had already turned green, and while he kept trying, she hit the gas and sped out of there. Story 6. I was walking down the street with a friend during college when a woman driving nearby hit a little girl and her dog. The girl, who looked about 7 or 8, had been walking the dog and passed by some overgrown bushes along an old, poorly maintained park. The driver did not see them. When the car hit, the girl and the dog were thrown in different directions. From the way they landed, it was clear they were gone. The sound of impact made a sickening crunch, and to this day, I do not know if it came from the girl or the dog. The woman driving got out of the car screaming and crying, yelling that she could not go to jail and that she had not seen them. I tried to tell her she would not be arrested because it was an accident, while my friend was already calling for help. The woman kept yelling and told me to move away from her, so I did because she was completely hysterical. Then she ran back to her car, grabbed her purse, pulled out a gun, and shot herself, collapsing onto the hood of the car. I was frozen in shock, having just witnessed 2 people and an animal die in front of me. After that, I felt emotionally numb for a long time. Later, a therapist told me that the woman might have been under the influence of substances, which could explain her reaction. I still think about that little girl and her dog all the time. She would have been around 21 now. Story 7. In 2006, I went to Germany with some friends, as I am from Italy. We had planned to camp in the Black Forest with groups from Germany, Switzerland, and Hungary. Pretty cool, right? Well, one night my friends and I really had to use the bathroom, but we were terrified to leave our tent because, the Black Forest is unbelievably dark. We finally gathered our courage, left the tent, and all went together. While we were in the middle of doing our business, my friend and I suddenly heard a woman screaming in the distance. We froze in panic, unsure of what to do, thinking maybe it was a wild animal. An older guy who was with us, I was 13 at the time, tried to calm us down, saying it was probably just an animal being chased by another one, which happens in such a large forest. We went back to our tent and forgot about it. The camping trip ended up being amazing, and I returned to Italy happy, almost forgetting that night. A few weeks later, out of curiosity, I searched online to see if anything had happened around the area where we had camped during that summer. I discovered that in August of 2006, just a few kilometers from where we had stayed, a woman had been found dead. Story 8. My dad was working in the logging woods early one morning around 5:30 when he saw a man leaning against a tree on the side of his trail, a bottle of rye whiskey resting between his legs. As my dad told the story, the man was an older black man wearing overalls and looked as if he were simply asleep. Still, since my dad was deep in the woods, he decided to check on him. He called out, "Hey, mister," but got no response. He leaned down and shook the man's shoulder, still nothing. Finally, he reached out to lightly slap his face, and the instant he touched him, he said all the blood drained from his own face. The man's skin was cold as ice and had a strange, waxy feel. He was clearly dead. My father was completely alone, miles deep in fog-covered woods, standing beside a corpse. To make things worse, it was the 1970s, so there were no cell phones to call for help. He had to drive around knocking on doors in a predominantly black area of the South, trying to get someone to let him use their phone. Understandably, No one wanted to open their door to a random white guy with a truck full of chainsaws at 6 in the morning. Eventually, one very cautious family opened their door, just enough for him to explain. The mother handed him the phone through the doorway and asked what number he wanted to call. He said, 911, I guess. When the police finally came and questioned him, they determined the man had simply wandered off drunk into the woods and died of exposure. There were no signs of foul play, just a man sitting under a tree with a bottle of whiskey. It might not sound like a horror story, but it truly was one of the scariest things my dad ever experienced. Story 9. This happened when I was 18. I was working at a bakery, and my coworker and friend asked if I wanted to smoke weed with him after our shift. I agreed, and we went to his apartment. As we smoked, we started talking about mushroom trips, and he told me about one of his experiences that he described as pure emotional torture. He could not explain exactly why it had been so bad, just that it felt like losing his mind completely. I could tell it still haunted him. Eventually, with his head in his hands, he said, "I really wish I could just forget it all." There was an awkward silence after that. Then suddenly he grabbed his stomach in pain and bolted toward the bathroom. I heard his footsteps, followed by a loud crash. When I ran in, I found him lying face down on the floor, stiff as a board, blood dripping down the bathtub where he must have smashed his face. I lifted him up and tried to clean him, but blood poured from his nose and mouth. He was dazed and confused, unable to answer questions. Within minutes, I realized something was seriously wrong. He had short-term memory loss. Every 30 seconds, he forgot everything that had just happened. He remembered his name and the city we lived in, but he did not know who I was or why we were there. Every time I explained it, he forgot again within a minute. After about 10 minutes of this, he vomited all over his bed. Panicking, I called for an ambulance and stayed with him at the hospital. I even wrote "Everything is going to be okay" on his hand with a marker so he would have something to read when he forgot what was happening. I stayed with him most of the night until the nurses told me to leave. He was still experiencing memory loss at that point, but when I saw him a few days later, he seemed completely fine again. He is still one of my closest friends, and we often talk about that night as the moment that bonded us. It still feels eerie how his desperate wish to forget seemed to come true instantly and violently. I still have no explanation for why he suddenly ran to the bathroom, hit his head, and lost his memory, but it remains one of the strangest things I have ever witnessed. Story 10. I remember when I was a very little girl, I was close to my aunt, who was my uncle's wife. They lived downstairs from us in a two-family house, and she would always visit me. One day I was sitting in the living room watching television while my mom, grandmother, and uncle were talking at the kitchen table. My uncle was crying, but when I asked why, they told me to leave the room and said only that his pet bird was sick or something. Later, my aunt came upstairs like she usually did, but instead of sitting with me and her daughter, she stood in the hallway waving at me and wouldn't come out. I thought she was just playing, so I waved back and went back to watching my show. She did that a few more times in the following days, but never stepped into the living room. Eventually, she stopped showing up altogether, and when I asked about her, my mom said she had moved away and broken up with my uncle. Years later, around the holidays when I was about 12, I asked about her again, wondering why she never saw my cousin. My mom and grandma looked at each other, and then my grandma left the room. My mom explained that Aunt Dee had taken her own life when I was 5. She had driven out to the beach during winter when it was deserted, gotten drunk, and overdosed on pills. The police found her car the next day. I never knew why she did it. I told my mom that I used to see her in the hallway waving and smiling at me, but my parents never believed me. Story 11. Back when I still lived with my parents and my sister was around, probably when I was about 18 or 19, I liked to sleep in. My bedroom was in the basement, so it stayed dark even during the day. One morning, I was jolted awake by someone shouting my name. I checked the clock, it was around 10, and figured it was time to get up anyway. As I walked up the stairs to the kitchen, I saw that our front door was shattered, and a trail of blood led from it through the kitchen and into the rest of the house. Every awful possibility flashed through my mind. Then I found out what had really happened. The mailman had startled our dog, and she had jumped against the glass door, shattering it and cutting herself badly before running through the house in panic, leaving a trail of blood. My mom scooped her up, crying, and we rushed to the car to drive to the vet, terrified she might bleed out. You have never felt stress until someone you love is crying in your back seat, holding someone they love, telling you to drive faster, but then begging you to slow down because getting pulled over would waste precious time. To make matters worse, we hit road construction and had to stop, which only made the panic worse as my mom yelled that we needed to find a way around. There wasn't one. Thankfully, we made it, and the vet saved our dog. My mom was shaken for days afterward, and my back seat was stained with blood. Looking back, it was one of the most stressful days of my life, and the worst part in the end was scrubbing those stains out of the carpet for days afterward. Story 12. I was backpacking through Europe and staying in Prague. One night I went out alone and decided to head back to my hostel to catch the last trolley. The place I was staying at was cheap but nice right at the last stop on the line. Unfortunately, I completely messed up. I got confused about the routes, rode to the wrong end of the line, and ended up in a desolate industrial area. There were no homes, just warehouses and the occasional sketchy figure moving through the shadows. I decided to wait for a trolley going back, but it never came. I even took the SD card out of my camera just in case someone tried to rob me. After waiting a while, I figured I couldn't just sit there all night, so I started walking along the tracks, hoping I was heading back toward the city. Eventually, I reached a river, and to keep following the tracks, I had to cross a bridge. I couldn't read Czech, but the sign clearly warned against crossing on foot. Still, I didn't see any other way that wouldn't get me even more lost, so I started across. Halfway over, I heard a deep rumble and saw lights approaching behind me. The trolley was coming. I had no chance of outrunning it. Without thinking, I grabbed the railing, jumped over, and clung to the outside of the bridge above the river as the trolley thundered past. The driver never even noticed. When it was gone, I pulled myself back up, trembling, and ran off the bridge. I eventually wandered through a lower-income neighborhood where I saw a group of teenagers lighting things on fire in a parking lot. They noticed me, and I made sure to stay alert. Finally, I spotted a cab, but the driver didn't understand me, and I couldn't explain where I needed to go. Then I saw a man with a saxophone on his back and thought, people who carry saxophones must be kind and smart. I quickened my pace toward him, but he sped up too, thinking I was after him. When I shouted for help, he realized I just needed directions. He turned out to be incredibly kind and explained that my hostel was only about 2 blocks away. Story 13. I have experienced a lot of disturbing things in my life, but here is one I have not shared often. My friend and I were walking my dog to the park in our neighborhood when we noticed a young man we had never seen before on the opposite side of the street. He was acting erratically, shouting at nothing, hitting objects, and moving aggressively. Then he crossed the street and began walking toward us. My dog, who loved everyone, immediately became uneasy and started growling. Never a good sign. We turned and began walking away, but he followed, jerking and twitching like he was fighting against his own body. We sped up, trying to put distance between us. I noticed 2 older men heading down a side street and decided to take that route in case we needed help. Just before we turned the corner, we looked back and saw the man sprinting at full speed toward us. We ran to the 2 men, told them what was happening, and when we turned around again, the man had stopped by a flagpole at the end of the street. He was marching in place and laughing in a high-pitched, manic way, his face twisted into a disturbing expression. The 2 men told us to go home and not worry about it, assuring us they would handle it. I have no idea what happened afterward, but I never saw that man again. Story 14. I am in the Navy and was deployed in 2016 during the height of the conflict with ISIS in Iraq and Syria. We had a port call in Bahrain, and one afternoon, a few friends and I decided to explore the downtown area outside the base. As we wandered around, we accidentally turned down the wrong street. They always brief us before docking, explaining which areas are safe and which are not, and I quickly realized we were straying into a dangerous part of town. It was broad daylight, so my friends were not worried, but I knew how unpredictable this region could be and suggested we turn back. Just as I convinced them, we rounded a corner and saw a house with a large black flag hanging in the window, an ISIS flag. The moment I recognized it, I grabbed my friends and told them we needed to leave immediately. Once they saw it, they didn't hesitate for a second. It might not sound like the scariest story, But at that moment, knowing how much damage our forces had done to ISIS in the prior months, I knew we could have been in serious danger. I am just thankful there were no locals around because that situation could have gone bad very fast. Story 15. Whenever I sleep at my late grandfather's house, I hear a sound that no one else seems to hear. It always wakes me up at least twice a night. I used to blame it on the central air system making weird noises. One night I stayed up late in the living room, and the noise was even louder, coming from the dining room. It startled me so much that I jumped from my seat. The best way to describe it is like a large paperback book falling from a table and bouncing once on the floor. At first, when it woke me up, I thought it was my cat knocking something over. But my cat was never even at that house. I never heard this sound before my grandfather died. And though I know where he passed away, the noise doesn't come from that spot. It comes from the dining room. It's loud, sharp, and happens without warning. We rented the house for 2 months and the tenants never mentioned anything. My family members who have stayed there never heard it either. Somehow, I am the only one who does. I still hope it's just something mechanical, maybe the sump pump, but I can't explain why it happens only when I'm there. Every time I stay overnight, it wakes me up without fail. Story 16. Back when I lived with my parents, I used to stay out late and come home around 2 in the morning. One night, I got home and went straight to bed, only to wake up an hour later to my dad shouting for my brother and me to get up and back him up. I was confused but grabbed my baseball bat and followed him to the front door. Outside was a young woman, maybe in her 20s, crying and pounding on the door. Her voice was muffled, but we could make out that someone was chasing her. My first thought was that it was a setup to get us to open the door, so I ran to check the other windows. I didn't see anyone else outside. My dad cracked open a nearby window to talk to her while my mom called the police. Dispatch told her that a woman matching that description had been reported missing for several days. Just as we heard that, the woman outside started shouting about demons chasing her and a shadow trying to kill her. We kept her talking until the police arrived. They took her home safely, and we gave our statements before heading back to bed. It was one of the strangest and most unsettling nights of my life. Story 17. My wife used to leave for work nearly an hour before I did, so she was always gone before I got up with our baby, who was about 1 year old at the time. One morning I heard her open the front door and leave, followed by some loud crashing noises downstairs. I assumed she had come back in after forgetting something and dropped an item in the kitchen. Then to my surprise, I heard her come upstairs and peek into our bedroom to check on me and the baby. Annoyed because my alarm wasn't set to go off for another 15 minutes, I pretended to be asleep. She quietly moved around upstairs for a bit, then left again, making more noise on her way out. When my alarm finally went off, I got up and went downstairs to see what she had dropped. What I found made my stomach drop. The noise I had heard wasn't my wife at all. It was a hero addict, according to police, who had smashed through our small transom window. The wife who came upstairs to look in on us was actually a burglar realizing the house wasn't empty. I easily outweighed whoever it was by 100 pounds. If I had opened my eyes and seen a stranger staring at my baby instead of my wife, I would have panicked and attacked. If they had a weapon, I might have died. If not, I might have killed them. Story 18. One night, I woke up to the sound of my dog's collar jingling up and down the staircase. Half asleep, I ignored it at first. But then I noticed how slowly it was moving. I sat up, wondering if he was hurt or needed help. The jingling continued, coming up the stairs, down the hallway, then stopping in front of my locked bedroom door. It was silent for a moment, and then the tags on the collar began tapping my door right at shoulder height. Knock, knock, knock. My body froze, completely filled with dread. I could not even breathe. After what felt like an eternity, the jingling slowly moved away, step by step, down the stairs until everything went silent. I waited several minutes before gathering the courage to check. When I got downstairs, my dog was sleeping soundly without his collar. The collar was exactly where we always left it at night, sitting on the kitchen table. I tried to convince myself I had imagined it, but the next morning my parents came downstairs and asked if we had forgotten to take the collar off the dog because it had woken them up in the middle of the night. I still can't explain what happened, and that memory chills me every time I think about it. Story 19. During the last week of July last year, my boyfriend and I took a trip to Ocean City, Maryland. The first few nights were perfect. We even met up with a longtime friend of mine who joined us for an evening out. One night, while my boyfriend and my friend went to get crab fries, I stayed behind on a bench because I'm not a fan of Old Bay seasoning. I noticed a family walking by, their teenage daughter lagging behind, texting furiously and looking angry. She had short bleached hair and striking tattoos that caught my attention. Later, when my boyfriend and friend returned, we ended up walking behind the same family for a while, but eventually got distracted by street performers and lost sight of them. Hours later, around 2 a.m, we were among the few people left on the boardwalk when I saw her again running toward the beach crying. I wanted to check on her, but my boyfriend told me to stay out of it, so we went back to the hotel. The next morning around 6, I got up early, rolled a joint, and went outside to sit by the ocean. I was admiring the sunrise when I saw her once more, walking down the boardwalk, looking terrified and lost. Something in my gut told me to follow her. I tucked the joint into my clutch and followed from a short distance. She kept glancing around nervously until she suddenly bolted toward the beach, sobbing uncontrollably. I called out, asking if she needed help, but when I reached the sand, she had vanished. The beach was empty except for the faint sound of crying. I followed the sound until I saw it, an arm sticking out from the sand, covered in the same tattoos I had noticed before. The sobbing stopped, and the sound of the ocean returned, louder than before. I screamed for help. A couple nearby ran over, the wife screamed, and the husband called 911. The police arrived quickly and began digging. It took hours before they pulled her body out. They later told us she had likely sat in a sand hole that collapsed around her sometime between 2 and 3 a.m. I should have felt relief knowing what happened, but I couldn't shake the memory of seeing her walking, crying, alive. As we were being escorted away, I looked back one last time and saw her standing behind the officers, watching her own body. She looked up at me, nodded once, and disappeared. Story 20. When I was in high school, there was a little-known spot about an hour from my hometown that was popular for cliff diving. It was deep in the middle of nowhere, with the nearest town about 10 miles away. It was fun, but also known as a place where people could get away with underage drinking. The cliffs ranged from about 15 feet to nearly 80 feet high. One of them, called Tabletop, was around 40 to 50 feet depending on the water level, and it had rocks directly beneath it, so you had to jump out over them. If you jumped straight down, you'd hit the rocks. Normally, clearing them wasn't difficult if you pushed off with even a little forward momentum. I'd never seen anyone come close to hitting the rocks before. That day, a group of teens showed up who had been drinking, not drunk, but definitely feeling it. 2 girls decided to try jumping off Tabletop for the first time. They were scared but wanted to do it together, so they held hands as they approached the edge. At the last second, the first girl panicked and stopped right at the lip, while the second girl couldn't stop in time and toppled off the edge with almost no forward momentum. About halfway down, there was a small ledge that jutted out, kind of like a belly in the cliff, and she hit it hard. It slowed her fall but twisted her body flat so that she smacked into the rocks before rolling into the water. I saw it all happen from another cliff about 30 feet across the water. Her body floated to the surface, surrounded by blood. Several of us jumped in to help, and others reached her before I did, pulling her to shore. She had a deep gash on the side of her head and several cuts on her arms. She was unresponsive for what felt like forever, but after about a minute and a half, she suddenly started coughing and crying. I had to sprint nearly half a mile to get cell service to call for an ambulance, which took 20 to 30 minutes to arrive because of how remote the place was. In the end, she survived with only cuts, bruises, and a severe concussion. She was incredibly lucky. Even now, years later, I still have nightmares about watching her fall. I truly thought I had just witnessed someone die. Story 21. When I was younger, I was almost abducted by an older man. It was winter, so it got dark early, and I was out running errands when he stopped me on the street. He started talking, saying I had done something I hadn't, and then suddenly grabbed my hand trying to pull me away from the road. I yanked back and told him to let me go, shouting for help when I saw a few people walking nearby. Thankfully, that scared him off, and he ran away. Looking back, It didn't feel too scary in the moment, but now it terrifies me how easily people can just disappear. A few weeks later, my friend and I tried to do something stupid, contact spirits in my basement. He had set up candles, a needle, and a makeshift Ouija board while I held his phone for light. Just as we were about to start, his phone suddenly died even though the battery had been full. We were left in total darkness. Later, when he plugged it in at home, it worked perfectly fine. I still joke that the spirits drained the battery, but honestly, it freaked us both out enough that we never tried anything like that again. Story 22. This might not be the scariest story, but it happened just yesterday, and I'm still shaken. I was leaving my partner's apartment around 11 at night. Residents leave their trash cans out in the hallway overnight, so as I walked, I passed by the usual bins and bags. One trash can had a pile of junk next to it, a few boxes, some random items, and a large glass jar that looked perfect for storing things. Thinking it was trash, I picked it up and headed toward the stairwell. Suddenly, the door behind me slammed open, and a man in his 20s with long brown hair started screaming at me for stealing his stuff. For reference, I'm a 5'4" woman, so my danger alarms went off instantly. I handed the jar back and said, "I'm sorry, I thought it was trash." But he kept yelling, shouting that it was from his storage unit and that people like me were what's wrong with this place. I tried to get away, but he followed me, still screaming. I bolted down the stairs, and when I reached the parking deck, I ducked behind a car to hide. I could hear him still yelling, calling me names, and I was too scared to move. Eventually, everything went quiet, and I heard the door slam again. I stayed crouched there for 15 minutes before I finally pulled out my phone and called my partner to come walk me the rest of the way. I don't think I've ever been that terrified in my life. Story 23. This happened to my mom when we lived in a rough part of town. It was around 11 at night, and she was sitting on the front porch talking on the phone with a friend. She said she noticed something move near our car and kept watching it closely for about 10 to 15 minutes while still talking. Then just for a moment, she looked away, and in that second, a tall man suddenly stood up from behind the car, staring directly at her. My mom is a small woman, barely 5 feet 2 inches, and she said he must have been at least 6 feet 5. She jumped up and ran for the front door, slamming it shut just in time. As she locked it, she saw him rushing toward her. If she had hesitated even a second, he could have grabbed her or forced his way into the house with us kids inside. Then she remembered the back door was still open to let in cool air. She sprinted through the house and reached it just as the man appeared there too. She managed to lock it before he could get in. That night still gives her chills, and honestly, it terrifies me too whenever I think about how close he came. Story 24. When Pokemon Go first exploded in popularity, my wife, her brother, and I drove to downtown Huntsville, Alabama, to play late at night. We had been walking around for a while when a man approached us asking for money. He said he had just gotten out of jail, but I told him I didn't carry cash, and he went on his way. It wasn't a bad encounter, but it made me uneasy and more aware of my surroundings. Later, I noticed a younger man walking around alone without a phone, which was strange considering everyone else was playing the game. I tried to ignore it, thinking he might live nearby. After a while, we started to relax again and ventured farther from the park. That's when I realized the same guy was following us. Every time we turned around, he would stop and wait, then start walking again once we moved. It went on for a few minutes until I caught a glimpse of him reaching into his waistband. I didn't turn around. I just lifted the back of my shirt enough for him to see the Beretta holstered at my side. That was the last thing I wanted to do, but in that moment, it felt necessary. He immediately turned and vanished down a side street. We didn't wait around either. We got back in the car and left the city. I had a legal permit and wasn't looking for trouble, but that night reminded me how fast things can turn dangerous. We never went out again at 1 a.m. to play Pokemon Go. Story 25. I live in a pretty bad neighborhood, and my mom never invested in any kind of home security, even though our house is old and easy to break into. One day I got home and noticed my bedroom window was open. It was supposed to be locked, but it's such an old window that a little pressure could have opened it. Since it was summer, I thought maybe my mom had opened it, but she hadn't. When I walked in, everything looked fine at first. My laptop, television, and PlayStation were still there. But then I saw my dresser drawers pulled out and clothes scattered everywhere. That's when I realized what was missing. All of my undergarments, bra, underwear, lingerie gone. Nothing else was taken. The thought made my stomach drop. Whoever broke in hadn't come for money or electronics. They came for something deeply personal. I was terrified and spent the night at a friend's house. About a year later, it happened again. I had gone out for the day with a guy I met on a dating app, and when I got home, I found my window open and my drawers rifled through the same items missing. I called the police, and they took a report, but nothing ever came of it. What scared me most was that my car was parked outside, so whoever it was either didn't care if I was home or had been watching me long enough to know when I wasn't. The idea that someone was that obsessed and bold enough to break in twice still makes my skin crawl. Story 26. One time I was waiting in my car while my friends went inside Starbucks to grab coffee. We had just picked up groceries and I was eating some grocery store sushi in the parking lot. One piece was too spicy because it had touched too much wasabi, so I opened my car door and spit it out. After closing the door, I noticed a man approaching from behind my car. He looked Asian and came straight to the passenger window, knocking and gesturing for me to roll it down. At first, I thought he might have seen me spit out the sushi and was checking if I was okay, but he didn't say a word, just kept motioning for me to open the window. My gut told me something was off, so I shook my head and waved him away. That's when he walked around and tried to open my door. Thankfully, I had just locked it. My heart dropped. I started the car immediately, reversed without even checking behind me, and pulled into another spot across the lot. I called my friends, but before they came out, I saw the man get into a car with another guy who looked Middle Eastern. Both were wearing small earpiece headsets. Everything in my body told me it was some kind of trafficking or kidnapping setup. A few minutes later, my friends came back out, and as we drove home, we ended up stopped next to the same car at a red light. My friends shouted at them, but they ignored us and sped off at full speed as soon as the light turned green. I managed to get their license plate and reported it to the police. Story 27. I have a couple of experiences that stuck with me. When I was little, my parents took my brothers and me to Mexico to visit friends. We went to a secluded beach one afternoon, and a little kid was sitting down the shore with a rag doll and a stroller. I couldn't tell if it was a boy or a girl. The child saw me. Their eyes went wide, and they suddenly started sprinting straight toward me. My parents were farther away, but my older brothers were nearby. My oldest brother stepped in front of me and stomped his foot hard on the ground to look intimidating. It worked. The kid stopped, stared for a moment with this strange, intense look, and then walked away. I'll never forget the feeling of those eyes on me. Even as a kid, it felt terrifying. Years later, I had another strange encounter. I was driving to what I thought was the police station to apply for my gun permit, but the GPS had taken me to their old address. I pulled over on a side street to figure it out. While I was sitting there, a man walked up to my door and stood there like he was finishing a cigarette. I ignored him, thinking he'd leave. Then, without warning, he opened my door and started climbing into my car, even dropping his bag on the floorboard. I screamed at him to get out, completely panicking. He looked shocked, stammered something, and scrambled out. I locked the doors and drove off shaking. A year later, it finally hit me. The poor guy probably thought I was his Uber. I must have scared him as much as he scared me. Story 28. When I was about 12, my dad owned a lumber business, and my best friend's dad was a contractor. We all loved skateboarding, so my dad donated wood to build a 6-foot half pipe in our backyard, and my friend's dad helped us construct it. One afternoon, I left my skateboard out there. When I went to grab it later, I found a homeless man sitting on the other side of the ramp, eating a crabapple. He started yelling at me, saying I had broken into his house and accusing me of all sorts of things. Even at 12, I could tell he wasn't mentally stable. I told him I just wanted my skateboard, but when I went to grab it, he lunged and caught me by the back of my jacket. I slipped my arms out of the sleeves, spun around, and swung my skateboard blindly at him. The metal trucks hit him square in the face. He hit me a few times before collapsing, blood pouring from his nose and mouth. I ran home without saying a word to anyone. My parents, my friends, nobody. I don't know why I stayed quiet. I was just a kid and probably too scared to process what had happened. I never saw any sign of him again. No body, no blood trail, nothing. I still don't know if he survived or not, but I hope he just left and found another place to stay. Story 29. This is probably the scariest experience of my life, one that left me paralyzed with fear for months. It happened about 11 years ago, when I was around 12, living in an apartment building in a small city called Sakaka in Saudi Arabia. Every day at around 2 in the afternoon, my dad would pick up my mom and me from school. She was a teacher, and afterward I'd go to a nearby shop to buy bread. In the summer, the temperature reached nearly 50 degrees Celsius, and by 2 o'clock, the streets were empty except for an occasional car. That day, as I was walking back with the bread, I noticed a small red Jeep parked right outside our building but didn't think much of it. Inside the lobby stood a large Arab man, maybe in his late 20s, wearing a white vest and pants, pretending to check the electrical panel. He was tall, heavy-set, with cropped hair, a mustache, and reeking of tobacco. As I began climbing the stairs, he looked up and said, "Salam." I responded politely. Then he started walking toward me and asked if I was Hindi, meaning Indian. I said yes. He replied, "Inta ibga fulus," which I didn't fully understand, so I told him I already had money. Then he said, "Ana ibga inta fulus," meaning he wanted to give me money, and placed his hand over mine on the railing. I froze. Panic shot through me. I yanked my hand away and hurried up the stairs. 10 steps up, I turned and saw him running after me, 2 steps at a time. I tripped and screamed for my mother as loud as I could, scrambling to the top landing. He suddenly stopped and ran back down, spooked by my shouting. As I reached our door, it flew open. My dad stood there holding an iron rod, shouting furiously. I ran to him, shaking uncontrollably, and told him a man had tried to grab me. He stormed downstairs looking for the red Jeep, but the man was gone. My legs gave out, and I collapsed on the ground trembling. That night I couldn't eat. I woke up drenched in sweat and terrified. I quietly took a small kitchen knife and hid it in my pocket, carrying it everywhere for the next 2 months. I refused to go outside alone. My parents never pressed for details, but they knew. Even now, years later, I still remember the smell of smoke, the heat, and that red Jeep, and I am grateful we left Saudi Arabia soon after. Story 30. About 1.5 years ago, I was walking home from the library around 2:30 in the morning after an all-night study session. I was exhausted and wanted nothing more than to collapse into bed. Normally, as a woman, I would never walk alone that late, but I decided to take a shortcut through a sketchy area near campus. Halfway through, a homeless man started following me. Before I could react, he cornered me against an old building, pulled a knife, and began screaming, "You stupid woman, I'm going to kill you." I was frozen. My mind went blank, and all I could think was whether giving him my wallet might make him stop. But then I panicked about needing my ID for my exam the next morning. I couldn't move or speak. Suddenly, 3 men walking nearby saw what was happening and rushed in. 2 of them tackled him and held him down while the third called the police and walked me home to make sure I was safe. I spent the night in my roommate's bed because I couldn't stop shaking. To this day, I never walked that route again. Story 31. It was the early 2000s, summertime, and I was around 10 or 12 years old. My best friend, who lived next door, told me she knew a house down the road with a bunch of cats. Being an animal lover, I was excited to go. The house looked ordinary, a small white one with black shingles, but I didn't know the owners. A woman in her 50s or 60s greeted us and led us to an old shed behind her house. Even as a kid, I felt uneasy, but when she opened the door, dozens of cats scattered everywhere, and I relaxed a little. Most were sickly with matted fur and infected eyes. One kitten was dead. The woman picked it up, sighed, said something like, "Oh no, I like that one," and tossed it in the trash. About 20 minutes later, I told my friend I wanted to go home, but before we could leave, her husband came out of the house. He was about the same age, clean-shaven, wearing a white shirt and black suspenders. He smiled and said, "Sure is a hot day. You girls want to come downstairs for a popsicle?" My friend eagerly ran toward the house, but something in my gut screamed danger. I grabbed her arm and stopped at the doorway. He was trying to lead us into the basement. Every instinct I had told me it was wrong. "My mom's probably worried," I said, and pulled my friend away. She was angry, but I gave her a popsicle from our freezer and told my mom what happened. My mom forbade us from ever going back there. 6 years later, we heard that same man had been arrested for abducting and assaulting a little boy. I still remember standing at the top of those stairs, staring into the dark and knowing without a doubt that if we'd gone down there, something terrible would have happened. Story 32. When I was 18 and newly enlisted in the Navy, I was away from my parents for the first time and enjoying the freedom a little too much. I was the one who usually planned the nights out, and my crew and I went drinking almost every night of the week. After a few months, I was exhausted but decided to go out anyway. We headed to our usual bar, a place we had basically turned into our personal hangout. That night I only had 3 drinks, but by the second, I had somehow gotten separated from my friends. 2 men I didn't know started talking to me and hanging around. I felt fuzzy, if something wasn't right. I tried to find my friends, but the men wouldn't let me leave and handed me another drink. The next thing I remember, I was in a car, and they were driving for a long time, talking about partying. We arrived at a house with wood floors and a fireplace, empty except for a single couch. The louder, more aggressive one seemed to be in charge, while the quieter one acted gentler and led me to the couch, telling me to lie down. Everything after that felt blurred, like I was fading in and out. I heard them talking, something about doing lines of coke, and when I refused, the loud one got angry. The next thing I clearly remember was him saying, "Take her pants off. We're going to do her." I managed to slur out, "I'm having my period. You can't do that. Are you trying to rape me?" He snapped, yelling that I'd wasted their time and money, calling me names, and told the quiet guy to get me out of there. I could barely feel my legs, but somehow I ended up walking to the car. The quiet guy kept apologizing and asked where I lived. When I said I lived on the Navy base, he froze. "You're in the military?" he asked. I nodded. He said, "Holy shh, forget about that guy. Don't worry, nothing happened." I pretended I was fine, acting confused and saying maybe I just drank too much. He seemed relieved, drove me back to the base, and dropped me off, begging me not to report it. I didn't. I was scared, ashamed, and worried I'd get in trouble for drinking. I told my friends what happened and ripped into them for leaving me alone. From then on, I stayed sober when I went out and made sure no other girl got separated. I saw those 2 men again months later and told them to get the hell out of my bar and never come back. To this day, I know I was lucky and that pretending I was on my period probably saved my life. Story 33. There was a house across the street from where I lived, owned by an elderly couple who mostly kept to themselves. Recently, their grandson and his girlfriend, both people I knew from high school, had moved in with them. One night I came home late after hanging out with friends and noticed their lights were still on. I saw the grandson and his girlfriend leaving the house quickly with a couple of large bags. I waved at them, but they didn't wave back, which struck me as strange. 2 weeks later, I came home from work to flashing lights and chaos, fire trucks, ambulances, and police everywhere. The grandfather had been found dead, supposedly from a heart attack, but the grandmother was missing. It turned out the truth was far worse. The grandson and his girlfriend had killed them both, the grandfather by smothering and the grandmother by stabbing. The bags I had seen that night weren't luggage. They contained the grandmother's dismembered remains, which they had planned to bury elsewhere. The motive was substances. They needed money for a meth binge. The story shocked our entire town and made national news. What made it even more surreal was that the girlfriend had gone to homecoming in my group just a year earlier. She'd seemed so normal back then, just another teenager. It's horrifying to realize how someone you once knew could become capable of something so brutal. Story 34. When I was a freshman in high school, my family lived about 5 minutes away from BTK, though we didn't know it at the time. When his name reappeared on the news after his decade-long silence, everyone in our Kansas neighborhood was terrified. One night, my parents went out for dinner, leaving me and my 4 siblings at home. Not long after, my older brother ran upstairs, pale and shaking. He said the phone had no dial tone. We all checked the other phones. None of them worked. Immediately, panic set in. The news had warned that BTK would cut phone lines before attacking his victims. My brother grabbed knives from the kitchen and told me to wake up our younger siblings. We huddled together in the living room, each holding a knife while he gave us a terrified little pep talk about fighting back if we saw him. The youngest started crying, and I remember my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. Every sound in the house made us jump. 10 of the longest minutes of my life passed before our parents walked through the door. My dad was furious at first for us being up so late, but when he saw our faces and the knives, he realized what had happened. He checked the house inside and out, assuring us everything was fine. The phone issue? One of the new cordless phones had been left off the cradle, cutting the connection for the rest. Months later, when BTK was finally caught, we found out he had lived frighteningly close to us all along. Story 35. In my early 20s, my fiancé and I moved into a townhouse apartment in a city that, at the time, had an active serial killer on the loose, or so people thought. It turned out later there were actually two killers working independently. Most of the victims were young women, but back then, it all seemed like one case. I was busy with work and school, and one night I was doing laundry in the communal laundry room. It was late, and our townhouse was the farthest one from the building. I had my headphones on, carrying a basket full of clean clothes, completely unaware of my surroundings. When I got home, I walked straight in, closed the door behind me, and went upstairs without even looking back. My fiancé was in the kitchen, facing the front door, and as he looked up, his face changed. He saw a man dressed in black, silently following me inside. My fiancé yelled, sprinted toward him, and the man bolted out the door and disappeared into the night. I never saw his face, but I've replayed that moment countless times, realizing how close I might have been to never making it upstairs. To this day, I don't know if it was one of the actual killers or just someone with bad intentions, but I'm certain that if my fiancé hadn't been there, I wouldn't be alive to wonder. Story 36. During the 90s, my country went through a brutal war marked by ethnic cleansing. I don't want to name the country because the politics and blame are complicated, but what matters is what happened to ordinary people. My uncle, a war veteran who later struggled with PTSD, told me stories that still haunt me. One of them involved the horrific tactics used by enemy forces. They would take women and children hostage, mutilate them by cutting out their tongues so they couldn't speak, and implant improvised explosives inside their bodies. Then, under threat to their families, they would send them toward military or police checkpoints, detonating the explosives remotely once the victims reached their targets. It was psychological warfare designed to destroy the soldiers' humanity as much as their lives. My uncle told me that one day, a woman he knew from a nearby village appeared, stumbling toward their unit, crying but unable to speak. The men recognized the signs. She had been rigged. When she didn't stop, one of the snipers shot her. My uncle said he grabbed his own hair in anguish, knowing there was no right choice. If they let her approach, they would all die. If they stopped her, she died, and her family would likely be punished. He never forgave himself. 2 years later, he took his own life. That story has stayed with me since the day he told it. I believed every word he said. Story 37. When I was a kid, our kitchen had a big side window facing the neighbor's house, only about 15 feet away. The blinds were always open, and my mom never bothered to lock the window. It made me uneasy. We'd been burglarized once already, so I always closed and locked it whenever I could, but she'd reopen it every time, saying I was being paranoid. One night after a school dance, my friend's mom was driving me home. As we pulled up, I looked toward the space between our house and the neighbor's and froze. There was a person crouched outside, dressed in dark clothing, staring straight through that kitchen window. Instinct took over, and I jumped out of the car, sprinting toward the figure. They bolted down the alley before I could reach them. I chased and screamed, but they vanished into the dark. When I went inside, my mom was at the sink washing dishes, smiling, completely unaware that someone had been just a few feet away watching her. I quietly walked over, shut the blinds, locked the window, and told her never to leave it open again at night. Story 38. When I was about 11 or 12, my parents sent me to a place literally called Jesus Camp. It was supposed to be a week of swimming, games, and Bible lessons, led by a priest who seemed fun and kind. He played games with us, joined our activities, and even took special interest in me, saying I needed spiritual guidance. One night he kept me up until 2 in the morning, playing checkers and talking about faith. At the time, I thought it was cool an adult treating me like an equal. But as the week went on, his tone shifted. His lessons grew darker, more intense. He talked about sin, repentance, and judgment. One day he told us about the rapture and said we had to be ready when Jesus came to take us. He asked who among us would be ready if Jesus appeared right then. Slowly, the other kids began standing up. A strange, heavy fear pressed down on me, like something inside was screaming not to move. My twin brother sitting next to me started to stand too, but I grabbed his hand, shook my head, and mouthed no. We stayed seated while everyone else stood. The priest had us all close our eyes and pray, walking to each child to bless them before dismissing us. I never told anyone how terrified I'd felt. 2 years later, I found out through a local news article that the same priest had killed himself. He was under investigation for the murders of 2 other priests and for possessing child pornography. I still wonder what would have happened if we had stood up that night. Story 39. When I was younger, in my early 20s, I owned an '86 Pontiac Fiero, and I lived in Canada. These cars are not particularly good in winter, and one night I was driving slowly home after picking up a friend from the airport in Calgary in a whiteout, with visibility so low and snow blowing across the highway that it was hard to know where the road even was. I came upon a semi-truck stopped in my lane. I steered left and the rear of my car immediately began to slide. I counter-steered the slide and the rear swung into the left lane, while the front of my car narrowly missed the back of the semi, sliding along the entire length of the truck. I counter-steered again to bring the car back into the right lane, the rear barely missing the front of the semi, and somehow regained control. I pulled onto the shoulder and stopped immediately, and police lights appeared behind me. An officer who had been driving behind me came over as I sat gripping the steering wheel, adrenaline coursing through me like nothing I had ever felt, and asked if I was all right. Story 40. Myself and 2 other friends went to a house party with a group of people we had just met, which in hindsight was incredibly stupid because it was way out in the middle of nowhere. We went swimming in his pool, and afterward I walked into the house to change, noticed a screen door leaning against the wall instead of attached, and figured I would tell the homeowner after I changed. I went into a back room alone to change, and suddenly the homeowner barged into the room screaming about breaking his stuff and then locked the door. I screamed for my friends as he began chasing me through the room, and one of my friends came barreling down the hall and knocked the door in by running into it, grabbed me, and the 3 of us ran to the car to get the hell out. The man came running out of the house behind us shooting his gun, and we huddled down in the floorboards while our friend navigated us out of there. Because we were in the boondocks, we got lost, and it took about an hour before we found another car that could give us directions to safety. I left my purse behind in my haste and was terrified for a long time that he would track us down with my identification, but nothing else came of it. Story 41. When my mom was a teenager, around 15, she was walking home from the bus stop with her 2 older brothers. She has cerebral palsy that affects her legs and feet, so she's always walked slowly with a limp. Her brothers had gone on ahead, about 20 feet in front of her, when an older man pulled up beside her in his car. He offered her a ride home, but she politely declined, saying she was close by. The man got out, grabbed her arm, and shouted, "Get in the car now!" trying to force her inside. Her brothers saw what was happening, turned, and sprinted toward her. When the man noticed them coming, he released her, jumped into his car, and sped off. My mom always said that if her brothers hadn't been there, she might not be alive. Because of her disability, fighting him off on her own would have been impossible. It's one of those stories that has stayed with her for life, and the reason she taught me never to talk to strangers. Story 42. When I was 11, my family had just moved to a new city. I'd made a new friend, and she invited me to her birthday party at a roller rink. Nobody else showed up, and since she told me her parents would drive me home after, I was stranded when the party ended around 8 in the evening. It was winter, already dark, and I had no idea where I was, so I started walking. It was at least a 2-hour walk, and somewhere along the way, I noticed a man in a car following me. Each time he'd turn or pull up, I'd cross the street trying to throw him off, but eventually he figured it out. He pulled up beside me and told me to get in his car. When I ignored him, he stopped, got out, and tried to grab me. Luckily, a woman inside a nearby bakery saw what was happening, ran outside, and scared him off. She took me in, and I broke down crying. The police came, And I got to ride in the front seat and even turn on the siren, which made me smile through the tears. The man was never caught, but I'll never forget his face.